So George Will this morning, that was a terrific talk this morning by George Will. He may mention toward the very end the phrase from Edmund Burke, little platoons. A great phrase, and really one of the most beautiful sentences in all of political science, which doesn't have a lot of beautiful sentences. To be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. Well, the two men who are here tonight, one who served as a Navy SEAL officer in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa, and the other who served as a Marine sergeant in Iraq and Afghanistan, they know platoons. On January 12, 2010, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake hit Haiti. Hundreds of thousands were killed, nearly 1 million Haitians were homeless in a matter of moments. Medical care, water, other services were all disrupted. And in the aftermath, two Marines, Jake Wood and William McNulty, pulled together 6 other veterans and first responders. They gathered funds on their own in medical supplies from friends and family, and they flew into the Dominican Republic. There they rented a truck, they loaded their gear, and they headed west to Haiti. And thus was born Team Rubicon, which provides veterans the opportunity to serve as volunteers in disaster relief and humanitarian crises. And meanwhile, another organization, the Mission Continues, has engaged thousands of veterans and civilians to team up and serve the immediate needs of Americans in hundreds of communities across the country. George Will also said this morning that only ideas have long and lasting consequences, and these guys have a great idea. And the idea is this, that veterans are prepared, and in some cases, uniquely prepared to tackle some of the most critical problems of our day. So we're going to talk to them this evening. Eric Greitens is the Navy SEAL I referred to. He's the founder of The Mission Continues. He's a former White House fellow. He's done humanitarian work around the world in India, Mexico, and many other places. He's a graduate of Duke and was a Rhodes Scholar and a Truman Scholar at Oxford, where he received his doctorate. And Jake Wood is the Marine. He's the co-founder and CEO of Team Rubicon. Team Rubicon has won the Classy Award for National Small Charity of the Year. Jake was named a CNN hero. He has written a book, Take Command, about high-stakes leadership, and Eric has also written a book, or actually several books. And this guy's a leader. He's also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, where he played football, and one look at him, and you understand why. I'm going to walk over here, and as I do, I'm going to ask Eric the first question, which is, explain to us what the Mission Continues does.
Sure. Well, first, Jim, thanks very much, and I think we'll have a really good time tonight. I always have a good time when I'm with Jake, and we've been looking forward to this, and we're really glad to be here tonight. So if you want to think about the Mission Continues and what we do, you don't have to imagine what a Navy SEAL does in Afghanistan or what a Marine sniper does in Iraq. If you really want to understand what we do, all you have to do is think about your own life. Think about people who you know and people who you work with. And one of the things that you recognize is that one of the things that's really meaningful to people and gives a sense of real value to their life is when people wake up and they have a sense of purpose in the morning. When people wake up and they have a sense of purpose in the morning, it provides a tremendous sense of energy and a tremendous sense of meaning to their day. It's also important for you and for everybody who you work with to wake up and have a sense that you have a team around you. All the Mission Continues does is really simple, is that we work with this tremendous generation of men and women who've done incredible things in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. And when they come home, we help them to see that there's a way for them to build that same sense of purpose and to also build teams through continued service here at home. One of the guys you'll see up on the screen here is Tim Smith. Tim Smith was a veteran, was one of our first Mission Continues fellows. Came home, and when I first sat down with Tim, we're on a couch just like, sitting talking like this, Jim. And Tim was, at the time, he had post-traumatic stress disorder. He had a few physical disabilities. He was working the midnight shift at the post office in downtown St. Louis, doing the best he could to support his family. And I asked Tim the same question we asked every veteran who we work with at the Mission Continues, which is very simply, how are you going to continue to serve? Instead of just saying to veterans, thank you, we also say to them, we still need you. We expect you to make a difference now that you've come home because you're veterans. And Tim said, I'm not really sure, but I'd like to find a way to maybe work with other veterans in some capacity. So we put Tim Smith through a Mission Continues fellowship program. It's an intensive service and leadership program where they go back into their community for 6 months, and our veterans work at organizations like Habitat for Humanity, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Clubs. They complete a curriculum that's designed to help them to build resilience, and at the end of that program, we have veterans like Tim Smith who come out, and they take jobs in the nonprofit sector, they take jobs in the private sector, and they often start their own businesses. Tim started a company called Patriot Commercial Cleaning. Today, Tim Smith owns this company, Patriot Commercial Cleaning. It's based in St. Louis. He has over 45 commercial cleaning contracts, and he's hired over 30 veterans now in St. Louis. Tim is a leader, he is a mentor, and he works with all of these veterans across St. Louis. Rachel Gutierrez, you'll see a photograph of her coming up here in a moment. Rachel was an Army veteran, served for 5 years. She came back, had to leave the Army due to some serious physical injuries, came back home, completed our fellowship program. Then she also started what, you talk about little platoon, she started one of our service platoon programs. And what we do in the service platoon programs at the Mission Continues is that we have groups of 30 to 50 veterans around the country who come together, and on a monthly basis, they go out and they do service work in their community. So what you can picture here is Rachel Gutierrez. She's got this group of 50 veterans, and they went out on their inaugural service project at 3 o'clock in the morning on a successive Friday and Saturday nights. They patrolled the worst areas of Phoenix, Arizona. And they went out to work with the homeless in Phoenix. And they started interviewing a lot of the homeless, working with them, connecting them to government services. They've helped thus far, that service platoon has helped over 40 homeless people in Phoenix to get off of the streets. Right? And they're doing this, they're taking those same leadership skills, those same ideas behind innovation, and they're putting them to work on the streets. One of the things that's neat about the Mission Continues and about Jake's program, Team Rubicon, is that we focus on results. I think both Jake and I are really committed to making sure that we get real results in our programs. We started at the beginning of the Mission Continues always having audits, efficacy audits, not just financial audits of our program. Today, our results are that over 92% of the people who go through our program come out and they go on to full-time employment at the end of the fellowship. 85% of them report that at the end of the fellowship they consider themselves to be community leaders. 52% of them who begin the program with a diagnosis of depression do not have that diagnosis at the end of the 6-month fellowship program. And again, our focus really with all of them is on creating these results. And I think what's neat about this is that we're dealing with people who are facing some real challenges. People who might have lost eyesight, been burned, people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury. But what we do for all of them is that we challenge them. And in that service work, we also have a lot of fun. Right? I mean, Jake takes teams into some of the worst places around the world, and we have a good time doing this because there's a real sense of joy and purpose in the work. I think the last thing I'd say, Jim, is that what we want to do at the Mission Continues is that we recognize that everybody who's here has a commitment to service, has a commitment to the common good. I think that one of the things that veterans represent in the country is the epitome of what it means to be willing to sacrifice yourself in service to others. One of the dangers that we have right now in the country is that we're in danger of losing a sense of what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be of service. When I was born in the 1970s, the demographic data kind of shifts a little bit. It's kind of hard to pin down exactly, but it looks like if you were born in the mid-1970s, your chances of having a parent or grandparent who served in the United States military was somewhere between 63 and 67%. I just had 10 weeks ago my first kid, first boy, Joshua, came here. I'm very excited about that. But if you look at the thank you. if you look at the data for Joshua's generation, the chances that he and the kids who he'll go to school with will have a parent or grandparent who served in the United States military, about 14%. Now, if Joshua and kids like him grow up in a culture where to be a veteran means that you are disabled, alcoholic, unemployed, suicidal, then the whole culture, the way we think about service, is going to change. If instead we have a generation that grows up and thinks that to actually be of service makes you stronger, to have been able to deal with fear makes you more courageous, to have dealt with pain can actually make you wiser, then I think we're going to have a much stronger culture. And the last thing I'll say, Jim, before I turn it over, is that one of the proudest things that we have at the Mission Continues is the fact that one of the first folks who was part of our program was Jake Wood. He's one of the best leaders in the country. I'm always extraordinarily proud to be on the stage with him. And if you do anything for yourself tonight, you should make sure that you get a chance to meet Jake and learn a little about Team Rubicon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Jake's going to tell us. So Jake, tell us about Team Rubicon.
That's a tough one to follow.
You can do it.
Yeah.
And tell us what it means, first of all.
Okay. Well, I'll tell what it means I'll tell the story. I think, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what Team Rubicon is. I think that there's a lot of potential for our organization and what it means to the United States and perhaps what it means for the entire world. And I say that with a sense of humility because, we truly are here with a sense of service. Team Rubicon started as an impulse, really. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps as a scout sniper. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I got out after 2 hard tours in late 2009. And I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I thought that's what I wanted to do with my life, but not, being a Marine sniper on the enlisted side, I thought, who the hell is going to think that I'm capable of being an entrepreneur? So I decided to go back and get my MBA, and I was applying to grad school when I woke up one morning in early January and I saw the news of the earthquake in Haiti. And I had an impulse to serve, just like everybody that saw the events on 9/11 had an impulse to serve. Everybody that did sign up and raise their right hand. And for me, that was my second 9/11 moment. And it was really a moment, I think, where a lot of people asked, if not me, then who? I looked at the footage that was coming back from Port-au-Prince, and I saw situations and scenes that were similar to what I had seen in places near Fallujah, in places in Afghanistan and the Helmand Valley. And so myself and another Marine, William, we took a team of veterans and doctors down to Port-au-Prince 4 days after the earthquake. And we started treating victims with mobile medical triage clinics all across the city, going to places that other organizations couldn't or would not go. And after about 2 weeks, William and I looked at each other and we said, what's interesting is all we've been doing here is using counterinsurgency principles to help people in need. All this stuff that the Marine Corps taught us to go wage war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's exactly what we've been doing to help these people. Small unit leadership, decisive decision-making, rapid risk assessment, the emergency medical skills that we had learned. And we thought to ourselves, wow, we had no intention of starting an organization when we came down here, but perhaps we can shift the paradigm in disaster response by applying the skills of military veterans to that industry. Perhaps we can disrupt this. Because traditionally, the humanitarian aid organizations around the world are very distrustful of the military. And so we thought, okay, in order to disrupt this, we have to start out and strike out on our own. So we called it Team Rubicon. We called it Team Rubicon because the Rubicon was a river between ancient Rome and Gaul. And no one was allowed to bring their armies back across that river, or it was considered an insurrection. And in the early 1st century, Julius Caesar brought his army across, and he said something, as he was doing that, he said, the die is cast. And it meant that there was the point of no return. And as we were preparing to go down to Haiti, we had to fly into the Dominican Republic and cross into Haiti near a border checkpoint that was by a river, the Arbonite River. And so for us, that was our Rubicon. We knew that if we crossed into Haiti, we had no excuse, and we were going to go and we were going to help these people. And so the organization started really as an effort to change disaster relief. But over the course of the first year, as we were deploying to places like Pakistan, South Sudan, and Burma, we realized that we had these veterans that were coming back from these operations and saying that this was the most cathartic experience that they had had since leaving the military. And so we started to think about what we could do to broaden the scope of our programs to include more veterans more regularly. And we began whiteboarding what that might look like when the urgency of that need hit us square in the face. My best friend and my sniper partner committed suicide in Houston, Texas. And his name was Clay Hunt. He was an incredible human being, unbelievable. full of potential. And the real tragedy is that Clay didn't kill himself because of what happened to us in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, Clay was wounded. We were snipers in 2 tours. I mean, there was a lot of moral conflict that happened. Clay killed himself because of what he lost when he came home. His purpose, his community, and his sense of identity. And after a year of anecdotal data, we knew that if we grew and expanded Team Rubicon, that we could provide those 3 things through this mission to a generation of veterans. And so we launched our domestic disaster response program, and we really saw an evolution of the organization where we went from a disaster relief organization that was using military veterans and had this subtle shift to a veteran service organization that was using disasters as an opportunity to continue service. Much in the same model as the mission continues, the notion that having purpose when you wake up in the morning can help alleviate a lot of the other problems that some veterans are facing, whether it be unemployment or mental health issues or lack of education or homelessness. At the root of those issues is purpose, or rather the lack thereof. And so over the course of the last 5 years, organization has grown. We've got 20,000 members in our organization in 10 geographic regions around the country. We've run something on the order of 70 missions, most of them now domestically, although we still run operations around the globe. And what we've seen is that we can continue to shift both paradigms. We can provide a new mission to these military veterans that imbues in them that same sense of purpose, that same sense of community that they had when they were leading squads in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we can truly, and we're proving this after every mission, shift the way that the United States and the communities respond to disasters at the local level. We can move in and we can do this more effectively, more efficiently, with more humility, with people that need this, saving communities money, and at the same time providing these veterans with that sense of purpose that they need. And you know, I have a lot of pictures up here. I'm not able to narrate them as they go through, but you can see the evolution of the organization. That one that just was there, it's gotten to the point now where cities around the country, when disasters happen, are requesting Team Rubicon services to come in and manage those responses for them. And the final thing that I'll say is that one of the most powerful images that I've seen over the course of the last 5 years is that battle-hardened Army sergeant, you know, who served in Sadr City in Baghdad, who has tattoos covering both forearms right there. Walk up to a woman who's lost everything in Topeka, Kansas, or Joplin, Missouri, or Bettendorf, Iowa, and realize for the first time that he's not unique. That post-traumatic stress is not just a military issue. That seeing other people in their greatest time of need is a powerful way to draw a connection back into communities. And so, you know, it's exactly that image right there that was just up on screen that we're trying to propagate throughout the country, making communities more resilient and making sure that when communities face crisis, that they look to the military veterans in their own backyards as that crisis leader when they need somebody to lead them out of a bad situation.
So would the two of you say that that the objective of your organizations is to help veterans, former service members, thrive outside of the military, that is to say, become employed, throw off the constraints of depression, or is it to help communities in this country and around the world? I always think it's a good idea to have one objective, but maybe you have two. Which is it?
So our focus, Jim, is we know that our focus every day at the Mission Continues is to help to create citizen leaders who are veterans. And we know that when these veterans come home and they go through our program, we measure our success by whether or not they are able to go on to full-time employment in the private sector, whether they're able to continue their education. We look at their mental health. We look at the success that they're having in their families. That's the way that we measure our success. And what we know as a secondary effect of that is that the communities get stronger. And they have a tremendous effect in those communities. And we put measures around the impact that they're having, the amount of volunteer hours that they do, et cetera. But our focus principally is we know that if we can help this generation of veterans come home to become stronger leaders, that it'll have a ripple effect throughout the country. But that's where our initial focus is at.
And do you agree with that, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely a two birds with one stone organization. We know explicitly the economic multiplying impact that we have in communities after disasters, and we feel that there's a significant gap in services from nationwide organizations that we fill. There are a lot of nationwide disaster response organizations that fill other functions. There was no nationwide disaster response organization that did what we did. But we're doing that, we're providing that service, while at the same time providing these veterans with this unparalleled sense of purpose and community.
So I want to understand, do the veterans work on a sustained basis? Is it, you were giving the example, Eric, someone who worked for 6 months.
Correct.
Is it episodic, or do you do it for 6 months or a year or 2 years or forever?
So for clarity, there's two different programs that the mission continues, and then I'll let Jake speak to kind of their model at Team Rubicon. We have a fellowship model. In our fellowship model, we've had 1,100 veterans go through this program. This is an intensive 6-month program where the veteran goes back and they have a specific program of work at, say, Habitat for Humanity in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They have specific objectives over the course of that 6 months that they have to meet in their service work. They have specific objectives that they have to meet for their own personal exit strategy. So they're going to get their resume together. They're going to apply to college. They're going to have met with 5 private sector mentors, et cetera. They have a specific set of assignments that they have to complete in a curriculum that's designed to help them to build resilience. That's an intensive 6-month program. That's our fellowship program. What grew out of that fellowship program was we found that our veterans were starting to create communities. They were starting to create platoons in cities because they stayed connected. So what we've done now is we've taken that and we've launched service platoons. So our fellows are now going out and they're actually recruiting 30 to 50 other veterans, and on a monthly basis, on a minimum of once a month, those veterans are going out and they're doing a service project in their community. So in Phoenix, Rachel Gutierrez is working on homelessness. In Washington, D.C., Vu Win is actually working on food security. In Orlando, Florida, we have folks who are working with kids in an after-school program. That is a lighter or medium touch program that brings together groups of 30 to 50 veterans in the community with that same philosophy, and it helps us to scale the impact for folks who can't necessarily participate in that intensive 6-month fellowship program.
And are you seeing similar results for the veterans who are working on a more episodic basis as you are with the fellows?
Yeah. Right now, most of the data that we have from the service platoons is qualitative rather than quantitative. We're doing the same thing with Washington University, and they're actually studying the impacts that we're having. What I can tell you right now, just based on the results that we're seeing, is that there's a tremendous thing that's happening where the veterans in the service platoons are solving each other's problems. Right? So you put together 30 to 50 veterans and they're helping each other to find jobs. They're saying, you know, I'm having trouble finding the right physical therapist, and somebody will connect them to the right physical therapist. Or, you know, I'm having trouble getting the right counselor at the VA, and they're actually helping each other to solve different problems in that way. So it looks to us like we're having a very, all of the initial data looks really solid to us. And as I said, the service platoon program just started last year, and Washington University will be rolling out the first kind of set of kind of more hardcore quantitative data with that a little bit later this year.
And are the fellows paid?
The fellows who go through the 6-month program receive a stipend that usually comes out to about $7,200 over the course of the 6 months. It's a living stipend that's designed to help them make sure that they can invest full-time in doing this work in the fellowship program.
And where do you get your funding?
So our funding is 100% from philanthropic organizations, from individuals, from some of our companies. So there's no government funding involved, but lots of family foundations, philanthropic organizations, companies who work with us.
Mm-hmm. And Jake, how does your organization work in this sense?
We're more like a volunteer fire department or the National Guard in many ways. So we've got 20,000 members who are registered, have completed some level of initial training, and they're organized geographically into 10 regions and then down at the state level. And each of those regions is overseen by a number of volunteers that we invest a lot of training into. And really how it works is, how it started was that when a disaster happened, we would activate volunteers within that region, say within a 250-mile radius of Joplin, Missouri. And if you could go, you could go. And what we typically saw was that if we tried to activate 1,000 volunteers, maybe 60 could show up, about a 6% ratio, right? Because, hey, you got a job that, a jerk boss that won't let you off, or, your wife's mad at you, or you can't get babysitters, whatever it is, you couldn't show up. And that's okay, because again, it was that volunteer fire department, that National Guard type approach. And what we saw was that this was very episodic. You can't predict where disasters happen, right? But what we knew was that this experience, this post-disaster response experience, was just so powerful. And we saw a very similar thing to what happened with the platoons. We saw after these communities would get hit and these geographically, these veterans in close geographic proximity would come together, that they would stay together. And they'd start to solve each other's problems. And they'd start to have barbecues on weekends. And we thought to ourselves, okay, if we're going to take seriously the second half of our mission, which is this veteran reintegration, then we have to put programs in place to continue to cultivate this non-operational engagement in between disasters. And that serves a lot of different functions for us. So to the extent that we can, we try to drive that non-operational engagement with training. Disasters are a very complex business to be in. And it requires people being trained in incident management, leadership. It requires people to have tactical and tool-based training, like heavy equipment operations, like people get in the military, right? We need people that know how to operate radios and set up communications networks, because we'll often have 400 veterans, like in Moore, Oklahoma, working out of a forward operating base, going out into the field in teams of 10 and 12. And there's a lot of infrastructure that goes to that. You need logisticians, you need all these things. So we started to see that we needed to engage our veterans in between disasters with training, but we also engage them on a regular basis with service projects. Rachel Gutierrez in Phoenix, Arizona, has hosted Team Rubicon on a number of occasions with the Phoenix-based Mission Continuous Service Platoon. And with that, what we've identified is that with our mission, we're able to attract a very specific type of veteran, I think, disproportionate to a lot of other organizations. We're able to bring in that veteran who served in the combat arms, the one that was the infantryman in Baghdad, or the tank commander in Helmand Valley, Afghanistan, who often avoids post-service veteran organizations for whatever reason. We get a lot of these combat arms veterans into our organization. I think it's because of the adrenaline of the mission. And because we're able to get them out onto these operations, we have the opportunity to approach them about reintegration issues in a very safe and trustworthy way. We're able to develop this trust, and we call it a kind of a Trojan horse mental health approach. We send mental health professionals along with our teams into these disaster zones, but we couch it that, we're sending these people along so that they can speak to the victims of the disaster. But if you want to talk to them, go right ahead.
Right.
And what we see is at the end of the night, they just got a line outside the door practically to speak to them.
So you see your work as not as necessarily a transition, as being something more sustainable?
I think
that
that
for an individual veteran, goes into your program for a while, and then goes into, I don't know, some kind of private sector job. Is that the model, or is it more sustainable?
No, I think the model is that at some point in 20 years, there will be a Team Rubicon chapter in every community in this country, just like there is a volunteer fire department, just like there is a Boy Scout troop, because every single community in this country is vulnerable to disasters, be it a small creek overflowing, a single family fire at a home, or a tornado that rips through and destroys 70% of the town.
Jim, what I'll say too about the Team Rubicon guys is that when they are out in any disaster, these are the guys who are both doing the toughest work, right? Literally, like, sometimes cover up to their chest in mud. They go straight to the hardest problems. They are working in the most difficult situations, and what's also fantastic, and here they're emulating Jake's leadership. In addition to that courage and that toughness, there's a tremendous amount of compassion. You've got Team Rubicon veterans, and they're out there, and people who are hurting, people who are in a difficult place. You've got Team Rubicon veterans who are out there, and they're also, in addition to cleaning up their houses, they're listening to them, and they're giving them a hug.
So
right?
are there
And they're there
certain
for them.
kinds of veterans that your organization attract? Or to put it sort of in a negative way, are there people who are getting missed by what you're doing?
I think that, I mean, what we found is that the Mission Continues model works for veterans across the spectrum. The people who are missing right now is that, unfortunately, and this speaks to a larger problem, is that we have right now a dominant paradigm in the country, which is unfortunately reinforced oftentimes by the VA approach to disability, where you often have veterans who are encouraged to think of themselves as disabled. And we've actually built a program in the country and a mindset that actually encourages veterans to think of themselves not just as initially disabled, but as permanently disabled. And what you find is that a lot of veterans who've actually been caught in that system for too long, I would say, are probably the ones who have the hardest time actually transitioning out of it. You know, you got to think to yourself, all right, you're a 23-year-old Marine, you're serving in Afghanistan. Right? And then maybe you come back and maybe you were shot or you're hit by an improvised explosive device. You come back and you spent your whole life taking on challenges, doing things, and then all of a sudden people come to you and they're like, hey man, you need a gift basket or a blanket, right? Or, well, what can I do for you? Sometimes they're literally wanting to hand people cash. And then you have a system, again, some wonderful doctors and nurses in the VA, but you have a disability system which also comes to people and say, listen, you're disabled and you're going to be so for the rest of your life. So what we're going to do is we're going to start paying you every month. Right? And that's kind of the approach that's put in. And we found that oftentimes people who've been part of that system for too long, right, it's hard for us. We come in with a very countercultural message, which is to say, we expect something of you. We're going to veterans and we're challenging them. We're saying you still have something to offer. And the connection that they feel to us is that we're often the first people who come to them and ask something of them. See, it's not good enough that you're watching TV all day long. We expect you to find a way to be able to serve. And so I think that it works for everybody. I think that the hardest group for us sometimes are people who've been trapped into this larger system, which can often encourage dependency. And
I know that Carl Zinsmeister and Thomas Meyer and others at the Philanthropy Roundtable are very concerned about this issue of disability. Yes. 45% of veterans today's veterans are applying for disability compensation. And it's not necessarily their fault, it is the system. I just wanted to get your impression of the disability system and whether you agree with Eric and on its negative effects.
I'll try to get through this without cursing.
Oh, go ahead.
I was an enlisted
We're in
Marine
Utah.
after all. No, you know, Eric hit the nail on the head. The system's broken. I was explaining a situation I went through at my table before coming up here, where when I was transitioning out of the Marine Corps, you had to go through this thing called the Transition Assistance Program. And it was about 45 Marines from far-flung units within our division, you know, guys that were in the supply corps, logisticians, cooks, and infantry guys like myself. And, you know, there was a resume writing portion of it. There was, you know, different various transition portions of it. But at one point, a representative from one of these large organizations, nonprofit organizations, gets up and he says, you know, points at the first gentleman. He says, "What'd you do in the Marine Corps?" The guy says, "I was a supply officer." He goes, "Okay, you got a bad back. I can get you 20% for that. Did you ever go out on a convoy in Iraq?" "Yes." "Fantastic. I can get you an extra 20% for PTSD." "You, young woman, what'd you do?" "Oh, I was an admin clerk." "You got carpal tunnel syndrome. That's an easy 10. You ever fire at a rifle at the rifle range?" "Great, you got tinnitus in your ear. That's an extra 10%. You can get 20% for the rest of your life." And this went on and on and on until he had gotten enough of a cross-section of different jobs within the military and explained the types of examples that they could go in and get rubber stamped out of the system. And you know, this creates two obvious problems. The first is economic. That's unsustainable. Okay, I mean, look, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. But then the other part of this is cultural. And you know, nobody can say it better than Eric just did. The Mission Continues, and Eric himself really, I think, started the shift in tone on this. You know, one of the early taglines at Mission Continues was, you know, it's not a charity, it's a challenge. And so I have nothing else to add to that conversation. I mean, you said it well enough.
Very, very important issue, but it really is, and it's difficult to talk about. But what George Will was talking about earlier today about the web, this sort of thickening web of dependency, it applies to veterans as well. And it's not that we don't owe veterans a lot, but this culture of dependency is not good for them.
Well, I think, Jim, we have to say, and this is true of veterans, and it's also true culturally, right? You have to really think about what I believe, and I think Jake can tell me if he disagrees, but I think we both believe this. If you really care about people, I mean, if you really, really care about people, then you also have to have the discipline to make sure that the programs that you put in place actually help them. Right? And it's not enough to just express that we have good feelings for veterans and we want to give them things, and that this intention is enough, that there's not just a morality of intentions at work here, there's a morality of results.
Right.
And we have to look at the programs to see what is actually creating results. And what we find most of the time is that when you're willing to go to somebody and you're willing to challenge them and ask something of them, and then they see that you start to believe in them, there's this whole cascade of effects that come from that, and we have fantastic results that come from those programs. But I think, culturally, we just have to say to ourselves, like, if we really care about people, like, we have to be disciplined about how we actually reach out to them, and we have to measure what we're doing to make sure that we're really taking care of them.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Eric. We get a lot of very obvious questions asked to us at Team Rubicon, and it's primarily, so you're sending veterans, some of them with post-traumatic stress, many of them, if not most of them, with violent experiences in terrible war zones, and you're sending them into communities after a disaster. Doesn't that sound crazy? And for the 5 years, I've been saying, well, no, it works. And for 3 years, I've been begging one of the smartest people I know, Dr. Mike Haney at Syracuse University, who runs the Institute for Veterans and Military Families, to come in and conduct a study of what it is that we're doing. And I was begging him for a year before he finally got back to me and said, Jake, really love you, but I'm not going to do this because I'm afraid that the results are actually going to come back and that this is going to be bad for veterans. I said, well, Doc.
A real social scientist.
Yeah.
No, I love Mike Haney.
Yeah, and I said, Mike, well, then it's imperative that you come in and do it. Because I think we're right. You think that you might prove us wrong. But at the end of the day, I promise you that we will shut our doors forever if it comes back that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we're actually doing a study right now with Dr. Haney. And I think he's changed his tune a little bit about whether it's going to come out good or bad. But.
So speaking of policy, what do you think about national service? Do you think we should have mandatory national service, either in the military or elsewhere? Forget about the military. National service outside the military, doing things like what you're doing for 2 years for everybody who's, 18 or whatever age.
Well, I think what you certainly have to do is you have to create as many opportunities as possible for people to engage in service. And whether that's service through the U.S. military, it's service through the Peace Corps, whether it's service through programs like Teach for America, I think we want to build a culture in which you ask people, what did you do? How did you serve? And that there should be a sense that the kid who's 20 years old should be able to answer that question.
I think that's the point. I mean, we do have those opportunities. They exist, but there isn't that, I don't know what you would call it, cultural pressure. How did you serve?
Yes, and I think that's really where we wanna drive that. And what I've seen, what I believe through what we do at the Mission Continues is we've helped to create that sense of identity among veterans, so that veterans are no longer thinking of themselves as victims, or thinking of themselves as community leaders. I think we should do the same thing for young people. I think generally speaking, when you look at the history of the United States, we do best when we have leaders who are actually projecting these kinds of values and helping to inspire them. Generally speaking, it's hard for me to think about, when I think about what our experience is with the VA, $180 billion a year organization with 300,000 people, and I think about whether I would want a similar federal program to administer service opportunities for people. I actually think you'd get better benefits and more intensive and quality service experiences by having things like Team Rubicon, the Mission Continues, Teach for America, the Peace Corps be able to expand those opportunities rather than having it be run centrally and having it be a mandate. But I do think it's something.
I think you'll get a lot of support for that. Got any comments?
I agree, and I agree in particular with one thing you said, and this, I think, for me, is really about leadership. There's a leadership deficit in this country And I think that deficit is being run up by a lack of empathetic leaders. And my first empathy and understanding, my first real experience with that was when I played football at Wisconsin. Being in a locker room, I grew up in Iowa, being in a locker room at a Big Ten school and interacting with these guys from cities all across the country, from backgrounds as diverse as you can imagine, was my first real insight into life outside of my cocoon in Bettendorf, Iowa. And then the melting pot of a Marine Corps infantry platoon. I mean, dear God. I served with a Choctaw Indian, a Puerto Rican that grew up in Miami, a guy from rural Washington who grew up in a logging family. I understood America after that experience. And so I think that, it's not just, there's an argument for why it makes sense from a lot of different angles, but I think that the strongest argument for national service is making more culturally aware and empathetic leadership.
And a football team is the ultimate little platoon, I guess, right?
There's a lot of that, yeah.
So I actually didn't ask you something that I'd love to allow you to expose to the audience, but who are your major supporters?
So we are still a relatively young organization, only 5 years old. We still get about a third of our money from grassroots sources. I'd like to think we do a really, really good job on social media, and so we still raise, well over $1 million, almost $2 million a year, just $20 at a time. Really? Goldman Sachs, Home Depot, Foundation are a couple of our big private supporters, and we don't take any government money. The way we're looking at approaching foundation support now is really as venture capital money. The way we see it is that we're in a growth phase right now, but I think that we have such a powerful economic argument to communities around the country that I think that there's a real chance for us to generate sustainable revenue through our services. And that's not to say that we're going to charge homeowners for the work that we're doing, but that means that I had a call with British Petroleum a couple days ago, and we were talking, they wanted to talk about our veterans programs. They wanted to talk about what we were doing for veterans, but I had a sense that the more congruent conversation between our organizations was about what we were doing in disaster response. And so I said, listen, we're conducting ICS 300 and 400 trainings, all throughout the country. We're one of the only nonprofit organizations in the country able to deliver and credential those training programs. And BP knows a thing or two about disasters.
Your next spill.
And her
Team Rubicon will be there.
Her jaw dropped, and she says, well, this is a mandatory class for all managers at this level and above. And we interacted once with the Coast Guard in this regard, and we walked away from it thinking, wow, if our ICS 300 and 400 instructors could take this with a military slant, imagine what that would do for us.
What is ICS 300 and 400?
Incident Command System. It's the governing framework for all disaster response. All local, state, and federal government agencies have to be NIMS compliant, National Incident Management System compliant. Nonprofit organizations don't have to be. We're one of the few national nonprofit organizations that's chosen to become NIMS compliant, just because having that experience in the military, you want to be able to interoperate with other organizations. And so it was a logical choice for us.
By the way, where are most of your people? I mean, are you in certain states and not others? Are you national?
I mean, North Dakota's looking sparse, but it's when we heat
They're
map,
so rich there.
When we
nothing
heat map our volunteer base, it's where you would imagine the populations are. I mean, obviously there's clusters around military bases because people don't often go all the way back home, but anywhere you see a metropolitan area, you'll see a big heat density of Team Rubicon volunteers.
So Eric, the same two questions for you about supporters and geography.
Yes, I mean, it's a similar story with supporters. It's no government funds. We've got a very substantial base of several thousand people who are making anything from $5 donations to several $1,000 donations. Mm-hmm. But the majority of our funding comes from our corporate and philanthropic partners. So some of our corporate partners, ABC, Disney, ESPN, JP Morgan, Southwest Airlines, Boeing, are all major supporters. Goldman Sachs is also an investor in the Mission Continues. And then we've had a lot of philanthropic foundations, some of them kind of venture capital foundations, like the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation was one of our first investors. But that's where the majority of our investment is coming from those corporate donors and the philanthropic foundations.
So we don't have too much time left, but I know that both of you have books coming out soon, or they've been out soon, recently, or
coming out
what's
in
the deal on the
5
books?
days.
5 days. So, okay, you got a chance to talk about your book.
Oh boy.
Real quick, but real quick. 'Cause we don't have
Yeah.
much time.
Well, my dog recently read it and said it was.
What is
If Hemingway and Jim Collins procreated, it would be this book. No, it's.
What's the title?
My book's called Take Command. It's really lessons in leadership. How to be a leader in crisis situations, how to lead small teams through the worst situations imaginable, whether that's as an entrepreneur, whether that's as a school principal, whether that's as a veteran leading a team down into Port-au-Prince.
Great, and it'll be out in 5 days.
5 days. I know everybody in here is pre-ordered, so it's okay.
Okay, good. You can pre-order. As long as it's not a Hachette book, you can pre-order it. Okay, inside joke. Eric.
Yeah, so very briefly, there's a book called The Heart and the Fist that I wrote. The Education of a Humanitarian, the Making of a Navy SEAL was the subtitle. The book that I've just finished and is coming out in March is called Resilience, and it's really a book about how people deal with fear and create courage, how people deal with pain and create wisdom, how people deal with suffering and create strength. We know this is something that happens in people's lives, but we often don't pay attention to how we actually build resilience in our own lives and in the lives of our families, our communities, our companies, and our teams.
And that's your 4th book.
It is.
So to tell us how to build resilience, like really quickly.
So, well, I'll give you a very quick kind of overview of the concept. So what's interesting is that the concept of resilience that we have in our culture right now, if you ask most people, how do you think about resilience? Most people would say, well, it means bouncing back. It means bouncing back. That's what they'd say. And that concept actually comes to us from physics. So in physics, you may remember there's a concept of elasticity. Elasticity is the measure of the ability of an object to return to its prior state after it's been hit by an outside force. And somehow we've taken this notion of physics and we've applied it to human beings. What we found actually with human beings, and I saw this in the Mission Continues and the humanitarian work I did in the SEAL teams, is that people can't bounce back. People can't bounce back because they can't go back in time. So the 19-year-old who leaves for Afghanistan is never going to be 19 again. The parents who lose a child are never going to be the same parents again. And what resilient people are able to actually do is they're able to integrate hard experiences into their lives in such a way that they become better. There's actually a tremendous amount of wisdom about resilience that Seneca, a lot of the Stoics had, a lot of our ancient philosophers had, because life was much harder then. And people had to figure out how you could deal with hardship in such a way that it was actually productive. And so I talk about things like how you create a sense of identity, how you actually use models to build resilience, how you can actually use some of the mental toughness techniques that we use in the SEAL teams and apply those to your own life. And so the book is written as a series of letters to my buddy Drew Sheets, who came home as a Navy SEAL from Afghanistan. And it's meant to be really digestible, actionable, and hopeful.
I just want to touch on one thing. One, nobody's more qualified to write about that. But two, we were talking at our table before we hopped up here about post-traumatic stress. And one of the things I brought up was the notion of post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it is, right? People can react one of two ways to horrible situations. And in some ways, it might be largely out of your control. I'm not sure. I'll have to read the book. But I know that I came back from Iraq and Afghanistan experiencing post-traumatic growth. The terrible things that I experienced or did or had done to me made me a stronger person. Now, I don't know why that is, but I know that I'm not unique. I know you're not unique, and I know that there are millions of veterans coming back with post-traumatic growth as their reaction to combat. And so we shouldn't just dwell on post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic growth is real, and it's in the veterans around us every day.
Great. Oh, time up. I wasn't looking at my own table. It says time up, right? Aw. Okay. Well, time's up, so I can't ask you the last question, but I'll do it anyway. So you're both entrepreneurs. What's next for you, and what's next for your organizations? Or do you know? Eric?
Good. Well, I think what's next in the immediate future, kind of the next sort of 2 months, is probably hundreds more dirty diapers. I mean, that's at least the trajectory that I'm on right now is with Josh. We've got the resilience book coming out. I think, for me personally, I know Jake and I have both talked about this. I think that the country needs strong leadership. And we need strong, compassionate, trusted leadership. I hope that what organizations like the Mission Continues and Team Rubicon can do is that we can actually provide a lot of that leadership to the country. One of the things I'm most proud about that we've done at the Mission Continues is that we've created lots of other leaders. Lots of veterans who've gone out into their communities and continued to lead. And my hope is that when we look back 20 years and we think about this generation of veterans, that their legacy will be one of a generation that went abroad when our country needed us and did hard things, but then came home and made our country stronger. And that's the track that I think we're on.
Absolutely. I wrote a document, an internal document for Team Rubicon about a year ago, and we just refer to it as the ethos document. We talk about the potential for Team Rubicon along 3 levels: societal, institutional, and at the individual level. And at the societal level, we think that we can change the perception of an entire generation. We think we can impact the trajectory of an entire generation of veterans. And we think that we can leave a lasting impact on society with what we're trying to do. We're foolish enough to think that we can have a chance.
Good.
And we're going to try it. And so I think that we can build an organization that'll last 100 years, not because we're clawing and fighting to maintain relevancy, but because we've built an organization that the country still needs. And I, as an entrepreneur, am self-aware enough to know that I won't be able to lead it there probably the entire way, but I'm gonna hang on as long as I can. I'm gonna step aside at the moment when the organization needs a better leader, and hopefully that's a graceful exit, and I'll find something else. I don't know what it'll be.
Great. You know, I'm very relieved that the two of you didn't say you were going to become movie actors, because I think you actually could. Good-looking guys.
I will
Good-looking,
tell
both
you,
of you
Jim,
guys. Yeah.
if you look at the last Star Trek movie, I and a couple of our Mission Continues fellows were actually in the Star Trek movie. It was a very cool partnership. You'll see at the very end, it was dedicated to the Mission Continues.
Mission Continues.
So we've dipped our toe in that, but yes. So,
well, I think the mission continues for all of us here in this room, and you know, this has been just a fascinating, inspirational hour, and I think we're coming out of this very pumped up. So thank you very, very much, Jake and Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.